Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're so pleased to welcome Benjamin Landry this evening in support of his brand new collection, Mercies in the American Desert. The chat is closed, but you may want to keep the chat window open as I will be sharing links to purchase the collection from Literati Bookstore. It is available in our store right now if you live in Ann Arbor for curbside pickup. We also ship anywhere in the United States. If you're watching us later on YouTube, there are, of course, always links to purchase books right directly below me in the description. And if you're watching live, of course, you can interact with us at any time using the Q&A feature that is available to you at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions at any time. And at the conclusion of Ben's reading, I will read a selection of your questions. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com. Again, we ship anywhere in the United States, and books are available for curbside pickup if you live in the Southeast Michigan area. In lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming, whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming. You can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us from. I now introduce tonight's author. Benjamin Landry is the author of Particle and Wave, shortlisted for the Believer Poetry Award, and Burn Lyrics. His poems have appeared in The New Yorker, Plowshares, American Poetry Review, Tin House, and elsewhere. He is visiting professor of creative writing in poetry at SUNY Potsdam. He can't hear you, but he can sense it through the power of the internet. So please join me in a round of applause and welcoming Benjamin Landry into your living rooms.
Thank you, John. It's really lovely to be not at Literati, but working with Literati and seeing you, John. I don't know if folks know this, but John and I were going through our MFA programs just about together many moons ago. And so it's been lovely to reconnect and to think about Ann Arbor and to think about all the lovely people that live there and were instrumental in inspiring some of the early poems that actually I will be reading a selection of today. This is Mercies in the American Desert. I'm not sure if you can see it here, but I wanted to show it because Bernadette Witzak is the artist who did the background art for it, and it's really, I think it came out quite well, and I'm really pleased with it, and I really thank her for her lovely eye and her artwork. So these poems, as I mentioned earlier, some of the early ones I'm going to read began back in Ann Arbor in 2007 or so. So it's been quite a while since, well, I've had the occasion to read some of them, actually. So lots of early ones, but also quite a few new ones. And I think you'll recognize thematically, at least, some of the newer poems that have to do with our contemporary moment. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being here, wherever you are. And thank you for supporting poetry during National Poetry Month and for supporting independent bookstores like Literati, which are wonderful places. And wish I could be there. I'm sort of having a cup of coffee in my mind in the top floor of Literati and reading through the latest poetry. Okay, this one is entitled Satellite. It's the first poem in the collection, so it kind of sets the mood. Satellite. We are being watched by. We have lost communication with. Technically, anything orbiting. All our names for them were auspicious. It was circumstances that didn't live up. And so, phosphorescent ejaculation, angelic cast-off, robot drudge with solar-powered foresight. With each pass, you tell us we are beautiful, and we are starting to believe you. The snow on the screen, ourselves, our smithereens. Still life. Wheeled to the window to blush at the folly of dawn. Maybe love is the afternoon, this afternoon of poised barroom darts, the empty threat of a green cloud with no mountain to break itself against. To crack open the vista and pour out all the birdsong into my 21st century hearing horn. But you will look at your hands and say, give him what he wants now, and when will it end? This one is entitled Museum on Fire. The 40-year-old caught on oxy reaches for his wallet like a museum on fire. Later, when his parents bury him, they become unable to speak his name and are themselves a museum on fire. When we sang Meme happy birthday, she could not recognize us and instead wore the absent look of a museum on fire. This last decade, when so little and still so much happened, I often caught it passing in a mirror, a museum on fire. When the White House deleted climate change research, that was a museum on fire. Sometimes love is patient, love is kind, but sometimes it is a museum on fire. Poem was kind of an experiment in mono-rhyme with that repetition there. This next one was inspired by one of my favorite poets, John Ashbery. So you might notice some Ashbery touches, I suppose. Hydrangeas. Now that they have lost their bonnets of snow, they turn their baffled heads to the camera. What's my motivation? You should have seen them last September when they were sunset pink. But the dead have the habit of sticking around, spilling out of the diners to vote conservative. Thank goodness the kids are in school and beyond convincing. They are unsentimental about the monster-headed flower and cut switches and take turns rapping one another on the thighs, as it has been done for autumns immemorial. This next one is entitled Black Banks, and the Black Banks are the coastal area right above Prince Edward Island. And this is really inspired by some contemporary wanderings, but also a memory of visiting them when I was a child. It's been a long, long time, but that sort of landscape really does stick with you. Black Banks. Like a nudibranch giving onto a tenant farm, we ourselves arrived by ferry, emerald in that red clay land. I would make the crossing many times in subsequent years outside of waking hours. It was almost indecent how it chipped and scalloped and made our living in relief. Stone was a factor, but by no means the only, nor the most important one. The trees counted for something, more or less vertical, regimented, windswept as brushes of baleen. Farm machinery rusted here and there in fields that refused passage today, as though, after much deliberation, they were sticking with their ochres and the dust and the sea spray they swore by. to navigate some tabs here. Excuse me. Sure, there must be a more elegant way of doing it, but I refuse to read off the screen. So, all right. From Atlanta, for Juanita Harper. She said what struck her most was the lack of street lamps in Connecticut. Her son, before he died, played a mean game of BB gun, one pump, each boy his own team, longing and defiant pointing at other boys, muzzle-hearted in the great stillness that was our field before everyone's pops came home. Years later, Julian picked the back of his neck and a long-lodged BB came rattling out, blue-black and scarlet, like the planet Mars you could only see in Connecticut, darkness like you wouldn't believe. So because of our employment situation, my wife and I both being in creative writing and both having to find work where we can, we've lived in many places. And before we lived in upstate New York, well, we're in Plattsburgh now, but before that we were more centrally in central northern New York. Before that, we were in Ohio. So this next poem comes out of that experience. Stock ponds, like pools of mercury in Ohio. When you live in a land so platter flat, you feel like the head of St. John the Baptist. I couldn't find a job. We went to the beach in Lorraine and decided against. That was the summer they shot Tamir Rice. And then even the produce sections of grocery stores felt defeated. Despite all the apparent abundance, the misters couldn't keep up. It wasn't always that way. It was once the blessed floor of a prehistoric ocean. You and I would have been dinosaurs with long paddle appendages, instead of newcomers looking for a clean swimming hole, searching out a windbreak, a tree farm, anything. This next one is kind of, I'm not sure that you will be able to see this, but I'm going to show you just briefly on the page what it looks like on the page. It's kind of a column of text running down the page, 2 pages. And it's entitled A Shaft of Light, or Shaft of Light. And perhaps you can picture the light coming down through the water here. Shaft of light, perhaps stammers the perhaps hand, perhaps brow of swimmers, that is chevrons of forearm and thigh, and a few bathing digital moths late arrived that could be fire-colored or set afire. How they grapple toward the present, understanding or threaten to disperse. Here's another one that does something on the page. It's a 2-column poem, left and right columns. It's called Gina, Haspel, and the Honeybee. And I'm going to read it in 3 different ways. First across, and then I'll read the right column, and then I'll read the left column on their own. So this is all the way across here. Gina, Haspel, and the Honeybee. Someone decided torture was a good idea, trying to warm up by the heat of a flower. And then someone decided, the bees on neonicotinoid, someone decided to make tapes of the torture, bees drowning on information, pollen bemused. And then when the public, stamen struck, came round to its senses, destroyed the tapes, losing track of time, lashed to the sepal. For years, no one was held to account. The temperature dropped, as though the incessant icings and drownings had been self-absolved. Toward dawn, stilled, somehow purified by war, unresponsive, until years later, a majority of senators resurrected their death angel. Now this is the right column. Gina Haspel and the Honeybee. Trying to warm up by the heat of a flower, the bees on neonicotinoid, bees drowning on information, pollen bemused, stamen struck, losing track of time, lashed to the sepal, the temperature dropped. Toward dawn, stilled, unresponsive angel. And now the left column, Gina Haspel and the Honeybee. Someone decided torture was a good idea. And then someone decided to make tapes of the torture. And then when the public came round to its senses, destroy the tapes. For years, no one was held to account, as though the incessant icings and drownings had been self-absolved, somehow purified by war, until years later, a majority of senators resurrected their death. You can see the poems are getting a little bit more contemporary in their concerns. How many will be too many? Fall out the mouth when what should be into arms, into bed, into money, into fortune, into future. Instead, fall, surprised, spun around, twisted, with or without words, with or without explanation, warning, and are caught on screen by pavement, between states, fall somewhere between living and dead, breath caught, becoming shallow, rapid and then none. Fall in our living rooms, even behind our closed eyes, repeatedly fall without indictment, with the hours like clockwork. Oh, sorority, please turn down your music. The loss of country feels comprehensive in these last throes of Jesus freak white conservatism. Thousands of hogs drift like bath toys in the plague waters of the diminishing hurricane. I want to tear up my money. In God's wind we twist. So maybe Bitcoin. But then it seems somehow there would be less of us, or more precisely, we would be converted into a heaven of heat in the upper story of a hangar-shaped server farm. Come back, northern white rhino. The mole in my basement awaits better weather, a more complete darkness. All I can offer is the squeak and groan of the washer dryer. Is that closer to love? Is that closer to an honest reckoning in the wilderness? I don't know. What I do know is that the sisters are now dancing unironically to This Is America. I should say something about the title, I think, that reminds me. One of the small changes that that my editors at LSU asked me to make was to change the spelling. The title, Mercies in the American Desert, comes from, well, the American Desert part comes from a quotation by Cotton Mather, the Puritan minister, who in one of his sermons, well, in Magnalia Christi Americana, writes, "The Christians who were driven into the American desert, which is now called New England, have to their sorrow seen Azazel, the devil, dwelling and raging there in very tragical instances." Sort of about warning his congregation that everything around them was dangerous. That in particular, the Native Americans were dangerous, and that they were representatives of the devil. And my conception of this book was that the devils are of our making, that we have set ourselves so many obstacles that may not be, that were avoidable. And what we are called upon now is to find the courage to address them. The American Desert then in Magnalia Christi Americana appears with a D-E-S-A-R-T and an anachronistic spelling. So originally the title was Mercies in the American Desert, D-E-S-A-R-T, and that was one of the changes that we made for ease of cataloging. But anyway, notions of America and what it means are throughout this book. Okay. Let's see, where shall we go next? All right, one more sort of contemporary poem before sort of longer, well, actually, okay. Yeah, I'll read this one here, Time of Asters. Time of Asters, it used to come so naturally. Now we wait to have a human feeling. Duck, 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 and cover. The new poll numbers are said to lull and dazzle. I won't read them, I swear. In the time of asters, I won't be distracted from their orange hubs, their blue flame spokes. All around is rising water and rust. The dead awake to the dream of our livid and living blue. Parkland. It is June, and not everyone graduates. Not everyone tears off their gowns. Not everyone races into the hot mouth of the night in a borrowed car. Tonight there is no curfew, but not everyone laughs and throws popcorn through the movie before sneaking into a doubleheader. Not everyone goes to the all-night diner. Not everyone passes out, blissed on the drive home next to the one they love for now, while the city runs in a loop by their window. Not everyone wakes to the first pale flush of morning on the houses of their neighborhood. All right, maybe two more poems, I think. This one's kind of ecstatic. it's the first poem of this first section. It's entitled Meep Meep. It's inspired by just Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner. And visual art and etc. Landscapes of the landscapes of New Mexico. Meep Meep. This against a backdrop by O'Keeffe. Desert skulls picked clean. Flowers like vaginas crowding out the cacti, sexing back the sun. How we run on and on. How we take turns painting tunnels into rock faces, going through, then effacing them. We're Bonnie and Clyde bundling TNT. We're the sort who scoff at tall glasses of water. Instead, we drink sand. Our delusions sustain us as we speed down the unmarked highway toward an improvised vanishing point. We never get entirely away. Our backpacks are stuffed with silver parachutes of grief. When we come to a cliff, we leap, or we saw off our own pinnacles by hand. The BNSF loops past us in the morning. When we wake, your flightless feathers curled usefully over my snout. It will end the way it began. Sometimes your love straps rockets to his old-timey roller skates, and you just have to let him go. All right, this last poem is a slightly longer poem. It's inspired by a poem by Anne Lauterbach, who did this lovely poem about St. Francis. And as I recall, the description is of a statue of St. Francis in a courtyard. And St. Francis is usually depicted surrounded by birds. And I thought, okay, that's pretty cool, but what about the other animals? So I put my Francis down in the ocean. Recent dispatch. Francis at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, cold, his hands curled with remembered cigarettes. There was once this thing called land, this thing called air, and sometimes ribbons of smoke drifting straight upwards to where frigate birds turned in a double helix, now just this null gone static with the slow, steady sift of calcium, powder of their hollow bones no longer needed. He thinks of the waist of his robes, the clutch of begging voices there. Now there are no human voices, only feather-ended tube worms fluting in the ceaseless discourse of whales at distances impossible to discern. His brother, he remembers, was a bureaucrat with a drowning look. Women and children were going down with the ship. 2. Francis doesn't believe in sirens. Each monster he recalls is human. Amen. Francis believes he is down here for a reason. Something required his attention. Shy eels, for instance, living in his hair, or maybe just a rushing silence that needed to be heard. He hasn't shaved his beard in recent millennia. The impossibility of steel rather than a symbol of devotion. Francis vaguely recalls the strength of the sun, the length of a day. The compassion fishermen showed to the gulls, throwing them bycatch, while the whale watcher barkers cinched a knot of hunger. Some gales, some blue-greens were left unsaid. Now in the trench, jellyfish are a far cry from transparent. 3. Francis swallows brine. His throat closes up when he thinks of the clownfish frisking with anemone. His mother was cold as the Marianas, but there was a certain butcher's daughter before he took his orders. Strange. He'd almost forgotten what touch was. And here the water touches him all over. A brittle starfish feels its way slowly up Francis's left calf. 5 zippers, 5 long stitches come together in a fine beaked mouth. He's reminded of migrations, but here seasons have no purchase. He is beginning to think this is original time, the blink in which he is painstakingly silted. Sometimes what comes down to him has a barnacle, a little volcano whose plates part, the branched tongue flicking out, a quick skein into lightlessness. Hunger fronds are the same everywhere. Ah, hunger. And again, the butcher. The butcher's daughter, caught in the rainstorm, striding over a puddle, and Francis's face shining. The brief flush in the present attracts heat vent bacteria. Where one plate plunges, one plate mounts the other, there is life. 4. It is easy to love the cardinal, to make oneself a perch, advantage. It is more difficult to love anglerfish, bioluminescent bait, to make oneself a patient lair, a spawning cave. Beauty less agreed upon, less a state of mind than a factor of perfect adaptation. A drift of stinging cells. The body must be a blank, must be a shade antithetical to that which comes as a relief. Pressure, few degrees. He believes firmly in firmament, but he got here by following a plumb line, and when the line gave out the logic of an unbroken trajectory, he fell across the threshold of each successive darkness. Yes, he'd say, it felt like abandonment, but a no less valuable truth. He feels like a child with supermarket panic or a latchkey kid. Dawning is simple arithmetic. 5. The time he has left here is a fraction, denominator unknown. In the movies, they are always saying forever. In the texts, it is shalt and shalt not. Francis rubs his brine white face. He suspects he is becoming a definite gray area. Unreasonable to solve for X. The plate gives another shrug. The butcher's daughter was always leading animals in by a kindness halter. She knew about time remaining in one respect, and was in others largely in the dark. It was appointed her to help scrub the floor at end of day. Pink smudge above one eyebrow, where she had passed the back of her hand, the spot where, just last year, yesterday, 1 second ago, something pelagic grazed Francis where he stood and wavering, as though he were an amphora glimpsed through heat, anchor or anchorite. 6. Francis wonders where to from here. No upwards, only onwards. Diameters and outcroppings. He feels himself driven against a reef. He is a wreck, but also a reckoning. The cardinal was a cheat, a scar. Far above, a school of barracuda. Silver and gills do exacting red work. They are the sea's concerns, and Francis is grateful arms far outstretched. Thank you.
Thank you for a truly lovely reading. I have so many questions for you. Not the least of which is to talk about a museum on fire, which I have like many questions about that poem alone, but I don't know how to put them all together. And luckily, Jennifer Metzger has asked two wonderful, brilliant questions, so that I don't have to try to ask mine. She writes, "It's so good to see you in my living room here in Ann Arbor. Amazing book, amazing reading." I'll ask. She's got two questions. First is, how do you navigate past and present, older poems and new poems, older ideas, Cotton Mather, and today's issues? Is devil of our own making always present?
Yeah. How do you navigate? Well, I think the first part is sort of openness and acceptance of yourself. Realizing that you were a different person. When I wrote this book, or when I started writing these poems, this was before I was even a father,
Mm-hmm.
And now our daughter is 8 years old. So a lot has changed, and just sort of accepting who you were, where you've gone, even your ignorance about certain things at certain times. Certainly the political or social justice oriented poems towards the latter section of the book are in some ways a recognition that I have changed, the country has changed. It's just a continuing realization. And so you have to, I think, accept and come to terms with maybe the sleepwalking that you've done earlier in your life, in order to begin to live productive and welcome in a productive vision of society. Yeah, it's an ongoing process. Yeah, how do you reconcile different historical periods in poems? I suppose that was another aspect of the question. And
Yeah.
I my father's a history teacher, or was a history teacher for 30 something years. So we've always had notions of history floating around the house, and having come from New England myself, that awareness of the Puritans and the encounters with the wilderness, or so-called wilderness, was also part of just life. But I don't know. We can learn so much from history, and I think Robin Costa Lewis's book a few years ago, "The Voyage of the Sable Venus," and also Natasha Trethewey's work, excavating the voices of people who were. Sorry, we live near a hospital, so we tend to be interrupted by ambulances and don't really register it at all ourselves. Every once in a while.
That's nice. Yeah.
We used to live near trains. Yeah. So that's I sort of lost my place there, but yeah, I think it's the past is fertile, just as fertile as the future.
Our second question is how do you balance the prosody / sonic aspects with the narrative prosaic? You do such a great job of that. Is this a conscious part of your process? I had sort of a similar question, which is just that hearing you read these poems reminded me of way back in workshop reading your poems, and also through your collections, the ability to, I feel like it's tough to try to carve out space for something that you can reliably write, like of form or sort of methodology, or that you can reliably do over and over again, and you have this ability to, within a collection, Museum on Fire is this play in monorhyme, even though again I'm super fascinated by the metaphor going on there. And
I can't wait to get your question on that.
I'm trying to write it in my head. But yeah, sorry, I'm getting away from Jennifer's question, but which is just how do you balance the prosody sonic aspects with the narrative prosaic? And my follow-up is, or my addendum is just your ability to play within this book has so many different poems that are, you could see a whole book of those, but instead you seem expert at finally crafting a singular poem in that style and then just leaving it. So yeah,
that's an interesting question, because actually I'm having this conversation with Kevin Fahn, who also went through MFA pretty much the same time as us, was my year, and he just has a book out. He won Colorado State, Colorado Prize, or no, it was I'm sorry, West. I'm forgetting what the series is called now, but anyway, it's a beautiful book of prose poems, and they are all prose poems, and my first book was all it was all poems that were in response to various elements of the periodic table. It was a project. It was sort of an enduring form that I could return to every time, so I could move on to the next thing. And this collection is definitely not that. This is really a collection. It is just here and there. And it has, prose poems and more concrete stuff, and, the 2-column stuff that I read, and longer narrative, the longer narrative poem. That is probably the most difficult thing for me is to write at length. I tend to love imagery, like quick images, and sort of and moving on. And I like the idea of not saying everything, not feeling like you have to say everything in a poem. So to me, it's kind of a joy to move on to say, well, I'm just going to try this one, and then I'm going to do couplets. I'm going to do, this unfolded over a decade though, so it's condensed time in the space of this book. So there were probably times when I did several poems of couplets all in a row, but only one of them made it into this collection in a particular spot. So I think it's a sense of punctuation. It's a way to break up the clauses of your thought, to put something in a prose poem next to a longer poem that has something else going on. And then there's one poem in here that this is, I think, probably one of the happier moments of this collection, was writing a poem where I wanted the title to be almost as long as the poem itself. So it was just like a little challenge. I just wanted a long poem. I wanted a long title, and just to see what I could get away with in terms of title to content ratio, and see if I could still complete an image that would say something or do something. And I'm not sure if I succeeded in that, but it was a hell of a lot of fun to do. Yeah. It's actually, I was going to think about reading it, so I'm going to read it to you right now. It's called,
Great.
The title is For Those Who Would Squander Love, the Earthworm Has 5 Hearts. Sometimes your language is unbecoming. Sometimes you are in no mood. Today is just such a day. Trees with their branches bent and broken under the weight of their fruit. That's it. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
I wonder, I mean, do you find, thinking about Jennifer's question, do you find that chipping away, moving on to something that's more prosaic or narrative, brings out a natural prosody or sonic character that you can bring back to, like, sometimes perhaps when we're writing in verse, we are so focused on elemental parts of the construction of the poem that the natural writing process of writing prose would seem to me to, this is just because I can't stop writing prose. I don't know how to write stuff first anymore, but like, perhaps like it's good to go back to sort of get some of that natural prosody back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, with prose there is a sort of, and I teach creative nonfiction as well, and for the most part in my intro class, and there is sort of a relaxation that happens as you write. You allow yourself to write a run-on for effect. For effect, you allow yourself to hell, go on to the next line just because it's too long. not necessarily having anything to do with lineation or line breaks, but there is, for me, just this like useful pressure of going back to the verse form that is productive. So yeah, there are times, particularly in the prose poems, where I feel like I need to return to prose, and there's something that needs excavation in a particular way that you can only do with with the flexibility of prose, where you can linger on something.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know. I can try to ask.
You don't have to, John. I just thought
it was
on the tip of your tongue, and then you've been fielding all these other questions. It's hard.
There's a comment here I'll send you to as well.
Should I open up the chat here?
Yeah, you can open up the Q&A and look at it. Right. I think I'll just try to ask my. I just want to point out that I was saying, what I really love about that poem is that the Museum on Fire is such a beguiling metaphor, because it makes sense, but it's not. It does things that I like about poetry, which is that there is a kind of thing that trying to describe it exhausts what it already is doing on the page. And that like I don't really know like how that metaphor is working in terms of like how, like what is what is it about a museum on fire that lends itself to these images? Um,
Well,
or
let me just stop you there for just a second, because I think if I explain the genesis of the image itself, which was I think it was the museum in Buenos Aires,
oh yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
and it was just like a national tragedy, right? It was, there's so much information that's lost, that was lost in that museum, even stuff that was not, on display. Um, and so I think that poem just sort of started as the things that are lost, that their lostness becomes apparent in a way that's like cataclysmic and
Yeah.
shocking. Whether it be someone who loses the capacity for language, or whether it be a relationship that all of a sudden is only about, how are we going to dissolve this thing, or like what are we gonna do with the dog or something? It's like it's like a very it's anticlimactic, but it marks the end of something. Yeah, so I was thinking like in terms of the big things and the little things that that mark the loss of an experience, or even of a person's way of being in the world.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the thing that I was like getting sucked into is just the sense of like archives and museums as archives,
Mhm.
and also like a museum on fire being like something that could potentially be radical given their gray space that the museum as archive occupies.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so the fungibility, I guess to use an in vogue word, of the metaphor, like that, what you said just unlocks it for me as well. But it was just like, yeah, something about the monorhyme and the repetition makes you consider more what's happening there.
Yeah, I'm not usually inspired by monorhyme, but that was
Yeah,
a challenge too. I wanted to. I mean, it's not technically a monorhyme; it's a repetend, or it's
right.
like
Yeah,
it's just a repetition. But I wanted to try to do something that used verbatim repetition in a way that um, also signaled like possibility. Like
yes,
that could be it could be like when I was talking about the microcosm or macrocosm, I was thinking about
yes,
shifting um, always shifting the potential interpretation of the museum, whether it
yes,
be like, or, museums are also these lovely places that we experience bodily,
yes,
that we think we're going through, like we think we're going to go see something,
right,
like even if we like have the ticket for a particular exhibition, and we are very focused about, we want to see X, Y, and Z, or we want to see the Impressionists, or we want to see, what, any particular period or whatever.
right.
So we're focused and we think that we're using the museum, but the museum is always um, directing our movement. It's because of the way the corridors open, we have to experience it this way, because we're going to go to the food court now, so we have to go past this, this sculpture that we hadn't thought we would want to see, but now we're really captivated by. uh, so yeah, that is also part of the museum on fire, the idea of being subjected to impulse, feeling like you have power, but also realizing at certain moments that you definitely do not have autonomy.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a wonderful poem. That's all
Thank you.
I can say.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. Well, we're at the top of the hour.
Yes.
Ben, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati. It's great to see you, and
Yes.
I'm
Thank you to
sure
everybody.
I'm sure we'll have you in the store for the next collection. So
Yes. Let's
uh,
plan on it.
we'll all have our vaccines, and something like normal will return. But until then, please be well, and take care. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
And
John.
we'll see you at the next event. Take care, all. Have
All
a good
right.
night.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.